Hello Math 3, this is Mrs. Bricky, and this video is for Unit 3, Lesson 3. We're going to be solving polynomial equations today. So we will be continuing to work with polynomials. Like in your last lesson, you talked about factoring, and the lesson before that you talked about, some vocabulary and how to add polynomials and multiply polynomials. But today we're going to have equations like this one. So equations have an equal sign. So all of your expressions that you worked with in the last two lessons, they did not have equal signs. But with equations, we have equal signs. And in this case, our answers are going to be numbers like x equals this and x equals that. If you have multiple solutions, you'll usually just list them separated by a comma. So we are definitely solving equations today. Solving a linear equation is very straightforward. Linear means degree 1, so here's a linear equation, and our strategy for solving a linear equation is to get the x by itself. So you can move terms around and try to solve for x. But it's more complicated when the powers get higher. We can't just get the x by itself anymore. It doesn't work because there are terms that have different powers of x. So maybe we get all the x's to one side, but then it's equal to 20. And you can't just divide. It basically, we have to have a completely different strategy. So our strategy is that we're going to use something that's called the zero product property. The zero product property says that if we have two factors that have a product of 0, then at least one of the factors must be 0. So we have P equals 0 or Q equals 0, two solutions. So for this first equation, we have x squared minus 3x minus 28 equals 0. So we want to use the zero product property. We're going to factor it to get x minus 7 times x plus 4 equals 0. And now that we have it into a factored form, each of our factors gives us one of the solutions. Our first factor, x minus 7 equals 0, gives us the solution that x is equal to 7. And our second factor, if it's equal to 0, then we get the solution x equals negative 4. So we have two answers, 7 and negative 4, and both of those answers make that equation true. So I just want to show you that it does work if we substitute back in. So if we have 7 squared minus 3 times 7 minus 28, if we calculate that, this is 49 minus 21 minus 28, and that is in fact 0. And if we sub in negative 4, we get 16 plus 12 minus 28 equals 0. So both of our answers work. Remember, when you're solving equations, you can always sub them back in and see if it works. So factoring is really powerful. It's a very powerful way to solve equations like this. So here's our equation. Now, when we factored before, we were using the zero product property. We used the zero product property right here. So you don't want to start factoring too soon. For example, I don't want to start factoring this because right now that is not equal to 0. And factoring as a solving strategy is only powerful if the equation is equal to 0. So we're going to just move some terms around. I'm going to add the 4x squared to both sides, canceling that one out. Subtract 32, canceling that out. And don't lose that you have an equation. There is an equals 0 on the right now. So we have x squared plus x minus 20 is equal to 0. So now that we have that equals 0, now we're ready to factor. These two factors are each going to lead with an x. We're thinking about that number 20 over on the side. I'm going to write out the factorizations of 20. 1 times 20, 2 times 10, 4 times 5. we're trying to get a middle term of 1, so we're going to use this combo with a positive 5 and a negative 4. So we have x plus 5x minus 4. So we have two solutions. One solution comes from x plus 5 equals 0, and one solution comes from x minus 4 equals 0. And sometimes people will do this in their head, so they don't formally write this out. If you can keep track of what you're doing, that's great. So you don't necessarily have to write these two equations out, but if it helps you get your signs right and everything, then you should definitely write them out. Okay. Next one, a degree 3 problem. So let's see. We want to use the zero product property. So we want to get a 0. So I'm going to subtract the x to the third, and I'm going to subtract the x squared. And I'm also going to subtract 18x. There's not a term for that one to combine with, so it'll just stay on its own. So this gives me 3x to the third plus 15x squared minus 18x is equal to 0. So the first thing you should always scan for when you're factoring, especially if you have a power of 3, is you should check for a GCF, a common factor. These numbers all have a common factor of 3, and these terms also all have an x in them. So we're going to factor that 3x out. That leaves us an x squared in this first term. The second term is going to be a 5x. And then the last term is going to be a minus 6. And if you're not sure if you factored your GCF out correctly, just simply do a quick mental multiplication and see if you get, what you thought you were getting. Okay. So now we're ready to continue factoring. We're going to factor x squared plus 5x minus 6. This is actually a little bit tricky to factor because the factors of 6 are 1 times 6 and 2 times 3, and both of those can give us a 5 depending on the signs. So we have to be extra careful. On this case, we have a negative 6, so only one of these can be negative. So we have to get a positive 5 with one of these being negative. So I think we need our negative right there. To get a positive 5 here, these would both have to be positive 2 and positive 3, but that would times together to give us a positive 6. So in this case, we can't use the 2 and 3. So x minus, whoops, I forgot to write my x. Okay, technical difficulties, sorry. X minus 1, x plus 6. Okay, so our equation is degree 3, and that means we have 3 answers. Each of our little factors, each of those x's in the factorization gives us one of our answers. Formally, you can write out each of these, or if you like, you can do this in your head. In this case, we would divide by 3 to get x equals 0. In this case, we'll add 1 to get the solution 1. And in our last case, we would subtract 6 to get the solution negative 6. So our 3 answers are 0, 1, and negative 6. Okay, example 4. So we've got 12x squared plus 33x plus 18. And this one looks like kind of difficult to factor. There is no common factor. Oh, there is a common factor. I'm super prepared for this video. I looked at all these problems ahead of time, I promise. So our common factor, which I didn't see at first, is a 3. So we can factor out a 3. That's going to make this a little easier to work with. So there's our 12x squared. That we're going to have an 11x and a 6. Okay, so this is a little bit tricky to factor, even still, because we have a 4 and we have a 6 at the other end. So I'm going to kind of write out a couple sets of parentheses so I can kind of think about this for a second. It could be that we have a 4x and an x, or it could be that we have a 2x and a 2x. I think it's going to be the 4x and the x. On the other end, we have a 6, so that could be 1 times 6 or 2 times 3. We have to try to get an 11. Oh, look, so the 4 is going to affect it. Remember, the 4 will times this one. So I think if we put the 2 here, that's going to give us an 8. And then we'll put the 3 here. And the 8x and the 3x give us that middle term that we wanted, that 11x. So we got it. I'm going to erase that little check. We can do those checks in our head or on our paper, whichever one you like. These just need to both be positive to give us that 11x. Okay, so we've got our factorization. Now, this is a degree 2 equation. It only has 2 answers. There's no x up here with the 3. It's just a 3. So that's not contributing a solution to the equation. Our 2 solutions come from these 2 factors. The solutions come from the locations of the x's. So 4x plus 3 equals 0 gives us one solution, and x plus 2 equals 0 gives us the other. So this one, we're going to subtract 3, but then don't forget, sometimes you also need to divide. We need to divide both sides by 4, so we get the answer x equals negative 3/4. Over here, much simpler, we just need to subtract the 2, so we get negative 2. So you can have fraction answers on these or whole numbers, just depending on the quadratic that you're factoring. Okay, so this one has some multiplication happening. So you may have problems like this where you need to distribute. We still want to also have our equals 0. So this is 8x squared plus 2x plus 10 equals 20x plus 1. So now that I've got the distribution taken care of, I'm going to go ahead and move some terms around so that I have a 0 on the right. 8x squared minus 18x plus 9 equals 0. Okay, well, on this one, I do not see a common factor. So 8 is 2 times 4, but 9 is 3 times 3. They don't have anything in common. I think it's most likely that 8 is going to be a 4x and a 2x. We have to get an 18. So if we throw 3's in, what does that give us? 6 and 12. Yep, that did it. So sometimes just kind of go with your gut. And if you aren't right on your first guess, rearrange, modify, try something different, be tenacious if you need to be. You'll find that combo. Okay, so we've got 4x minus 3 equals 0 and 2x minus 3 equals 0. Those will give us our 2 solutions. So add the 3 here, and then we need to divide by the 4. So we get 3/4. And then over here, we also need to add the 3, but this time we just need to divide by 2, so 3/2. And leaving your answer in fraction form like this is perfect. You don't need to turn those into decimals or anything. Okay, these 2 equations look so similar, but they are so different, and they have different solutions. So just make sure that you're using all of your good factor strategies. Look for common factors. Look for differences of squares. So this one, we just have a 0 middle term. So when we factor it, the 2 factors are going to look identical. And to get that middle term to cancel out, we need a plus and a minus with our 2 factors. So you can see the 9x squared, you can see the minus 4. The middle term is a positive 6x and a negative 6x, so those cancel out. Always when you're factoring, you can multiply out your 2 factors to see if you were correct. So our 2 solutions come from our 2 factors. And you can see that they're going to be almost the same, just a sign difference. So we get 3x is equal to 2, or 3x is equal to negative 2. So when we divide by 3, we get positive and negative 2/3, and you can use a plus and minus symbol like that if you want, or you can separate them with a comma. This second problem looks almost the same, but the 4x is not a -4, it's a -4x. So this is just a common factor of x. That's the only thing they have in common. 9 and 4 don't share any common factors. So our two solutions, well, the first one is just 0. The second one, we'll finish solving by adding 4 and then dividing by 9. So our two answers for this equation are 0 and 4/9. So really watch out for even just subtle differences, like whether that has an x or not can make a big difference. Okay, this is the last one. I have 128x to the third plus 14x squared. And on the other side, I have a 2x times by a 7x plus 1. So we do need to go ahead and distribute here. So that's 14x squared plus 2x. When we subtract some terms, we have a cancellation on both sides. And then I'm also going to subtract the 2x. Oh, I don't know why I wrote that. That's kind of funny. Okay, 128x to the third minus 2x equals 0. Okay, so we have a common factor here of 2x. I think my battery is dying because my handwriting is getting really bad. 64x squared minus 1 when we factor out that 2x. So we've got a 2x, and we need to try to factor the 64x squared minus 1. This is the type that has the 0 middle term. So that's 8x plus 1 and 8x minus 1. So we've got three answers. Our first factor is 2x equals 0. Our second factor is 8x plus 1, so we're going to set that equal to 0. And our last one, 8x minus 1 equals 0. Those give us our three answers. So for this one, we just need to divide by 2, and we get 0. We're going to subtract 1 here to get 8x equals -1, and then divide by that 8 to get -1/8. And on the last one, we're going to add 1 and then divide by 8. So positive 1/8. Okay, so that's our last one. It had three answers. It was degree 3. Remember that degree always tells us how many answers we should be looking for. All right, so that's it for lesson 3.3. Let me or your teacher know if you have any questions. Thank you.